Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel today. We just want to introduce ourselves and then we'll share a little bit about our organization and our work. My name is Talila Lewis. I'm an attorney with HERD. Esperanza?
Hi, I'm Esperanza. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a social worker and advocate for HERD. Kai?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kai. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an advocate for HERD.
This is TL signing. Thank you. Just to let everyone know, we have a little bit of a different style when we present because we're working with an interpreting team. So you notice that we tend to sign our name first and then whatever our comment is. So this is TL still signing. I just kind of maybe want to synthesize what HERD is and what HERD does. HERD was founded back in 2011 to focus on disabled people. Our sign for disabled today will be using DA, deaf, but we primarily focus on deaf, deafblind, deaf disabled, and hard of hearing people who are currently being funneled into the carceral system with no accommodations, no one tracking where they are, etc. And before 2011, we also, before we set up the organization, noticed that there were a lot of wrongful convictions happening. And it seemed that attorneys and advocates didn't understand that that was actually even going on of deaf people and disabled people as well. So young, deaf, disabled people in DC, Maryland, Virginia area decided to go ahead and try to address this void. And I wonder if maybe one of you want to add to what our everyday work looks like.
This is Esperanza. Sure. We want to prevent our community from experiencing any sort of violence, that cycle of violence, and we would like to move also to defund and dismantle the prison and police systems.
This is TL signing. Kai, did you want to add anything?
Sure, this is Kai signing. Part of our goal is to make sure that the information we present is accessible to the deaf and disabled communities, while also providing trainings and education to lawyers who work with the deaf and disabled communities.
TL signing, yeah, and I will add that HERD created the first and only national database of deaf and disabled people in the prison system, because before we set that up, no one was tracking where deaf, deafblind, deaf disabled, and hard of hearing people actually were in the system, where they were in psychiatric hospitals and civil commitment, for example. All of these different carceral spaces, no one seemed to know where they were, and they definitely were there. We were fighting for their rights, but no one was keeping track of where they were, how many there were, what advocacy was needed. So that's really a super summary of what HERD does. Oh, Esperanza, go ahead.
Sure. This is Esperanza. I wanted to add that HERD doesn't just focus on currently incarcerated people, but also returned citizens. We focus on any of the advocacy needs that they have.
This is TL, right. And it's really important to support people who are coming home. Without that, they go straight back to prison. And we want to also acknowledge that deaf, disabled people also actually return to prison much more quickly than non-disabled people. And I think we talk about that a little bit later, but I guess for now we'll open with some questions.
Sure, this is Kai. So deaf and disabled people seem to be getting arrested and wrongfully convicted at a higher rate. TL, do you mind sharing a few words as to why that might be?
TL signing. So I think you all probably have noticed people really strong talking about racism and classism quite a bit as related to being at the heart of the criminal legal system. And people have been discussing that for generations, and that is very true. Racism is at the heart of the criminal legal system. Oppression of people who are low or no income also is critically important to understanding why the legal system is so unjust. But also ableism is critically important and lies at the heart of how the criminal legal system works. And all of these different identities combined actually result in even more disadvantages and inequities. So we see that deaf, disabled people are being disproportionately arrested, surveilled, spending longer time in prisons, receiving these longer sentences than non-disabled people, and going back to prisons faster because parole and probation systems haven't even set up mechanisms to make sure that things are accessible. So what we find is people who are deemed disabled or otherwise disposable are the people who the system kind of rounds up, and those are always marginalized and multiply marginalized people. And unfortunately, that includes deaf and disabled people also.
This is Esperanza. I would completely agree with you. One example, of course, is Rico, who is one of many in his situation. As TL has mentioned, he's Black, he's deaf, he's a man, and was wrongfully convicted and put in prison. And of course, you know, there are several different reasons behind that that we could touch on.
This is TL. Also, lawyers, judges, police, and other people who are involved in the criminal legal system and the operation or administration of the system often don't include ableism in their understanding or in their practicing in their work. So for instance, police are taught that particular behaviors that are actually disability behaviors are indicative of deceit. There's no honoring of various cultures, whether that be racial, ethnic cultures, or disability cultures. Judgments are by police are made based on those behaviors because they base their understandings on this concept of normality, which of course is a very dangerous concept, especially when everyone else deviates from the set norm. And those preconceived notions are really harmful.
This is Kai signing. Now we're going to show you a video of Rico's interrogation and his subsequent arrest.
This is TL signing. Rico, thank you for joining this panel on Wrongful Conviction Day 2020 with us. We really appreciate you joining our panel.
Thank you.
Of course. We at Heard have a list of questions for you, and we look forward to seeing your responses to those. And then we also want some advice that you'll have for lawyers and deaf disabled people who end up interacting with the system a little bit later. But my opening question for you, first, I want to let you know we just showed the audience your interrogation video. with the signing police officer, retired officer, the two detectives seated at the table, you and your lawyer. We just showed that. So I want you to know that. But understand, many of the people in the audience are hearing and not from deaf or disability communities. And lawyers and police often assume a lot of things, like maybe that everyone can read or write English. But we know that deaf and disabled people sometimes tend to use other languages. For example, American Sign Language, Mexican Sign Language, and other languages. I'm wondering if you could really relate that to your current situation, or what happened what happens when police and lawyers assume that everyone can understand and read and write English?
Yeah, I mean, in my situation, when the detectives and the attorney, assumed that I had good skills with English, that I could read and write it. I mean, my primary language is American Sign Language. American Sign Language is more concise and to the point. English is a little bit more drawn out, a little bit more linear, and it doesn't fit me. I need ASL to really clearly understand the full picture of what's going on, But again, those detectives, they thought that I was fine with English, but honestly, like, I needed ASL for being able to actually understand. But they thought, since my education was with English, that that was fine, but it wasn't.
This is TL signing. I'm wondering, help us understand, what are the concerns about using writing back and forth during maybe an interrogation with a deaf person? What's wrong with that? What are the concerns that arise?
Sure. So this is Kai signing. I'm really happy you asked that question. So English and ASL are completely separate languages. Also, American Sign Language is different from other sign languages you might see around the world. So when a signing deaf person is interrogated in writing, you're automatically making the assumption about their ability to read and write in English. So it's really important to understand that deaf people's language proficiencies are highly varied. If you think about people who can hear, it's safe to assume that they know English, Spanish, or another spoken language. And yes, some hearing people might not be literate, but you can expect that they at least know a spoken language. And the reason for this is that babies who can hear learn language naturally and just from their environment. They don't have to be formally taught a language. Just by being exposed, they'll absorb the language. The situation for deaf babies is a bit different. Most don't have the opportunity to learn sign when they're young. Hearing parents don't sign, or they're not sent to schools that provide sign language instruction. They're sent to speech training. Doctors will encourage the use of hearing aids or cochlear implants, and that way discourages the use of sign language. And so because they're deaf, they can't just learn a spoken language from the environment because they have limited access to it. And sign language isn't always available for them. So this leads to variation of language abilities amongst the deaf community. Some deaf people know sign language and have virtually no knowledge of reading and writing English, while others can speak and don't know sign language at all. And most of us are somewhere in between. Also, it's important to remember that some deaf people never require any language at all, simply because they haven't had the opportunity to do so. This language variation and proficiency is why it's not appropriate and potentially dangerous to interrogate a signing deaf person in writing. And as I mentioned before, English and ASL are separate languages. So I want to give you a few examples of how they might differ. So ASL doesn't use articles such as a, an, or the. In addition, American Sign Language doesn't use inflectional morphology in order to show tense of when something is happening. So for example, in English, you might see words that end in ed or ing in order to show when it's happening. This doesn't mean that tense doesn't occur in ASL or nominals don't occur in ASL, but they're used with different mechanisms and different strategies. American Sign Language has much more flexible word order, more so than English. For example, English uses subject, verb, object word order, but in American Sign Language, you can use subject, verb, object, or object, verb, subject, which can cause confusion in writing. ASL has signs for an English word that has more than one meaning. So for example, the English word run. We can say that someone is running when they're performing an activity or doing something physical, but you can also use it with a political connotation when someone's running for a certain political position. So there's two separate signs for that in ASL. On the other end of the spectrum, ASL might have a single sign for multiple English words. So the sign for institute could mean institution. The sign for rights and are you okay also falls into this category. But the sign I signed before could be used for institute, deaf school, college campus, or institution. So these are just a few examples, but I hope this makes clear that there's a huge risk for cross-language misunderstandings and breakdowns in communication. And that's why it isn't appropriate to use writing in order to communicate during interrogations.
This is TL. Herd has noticed that often deaf people who use ASL as a primary language, just like you, there's so many breakdowns in communication between police and lawyers. Did you have an interpreter when you were interacting with the police at any point in time? Did you have an interpreter? Can you expand on that for us?
Well, yeah, this is Rico, and when they first found an interpreter, brought in an interpreter, that person was spelling everything out, but that's not ASL, and it's not really the best way for me to communicate. I need ASL, and I asked for an actual ASL interpreter, and they said no, nobody's available. We don't have time to find someone. And I felt really pressured to just keep going because, when they were saying they didn't have time to find someone, I had already been sitting there for 14 hours. But this person, she just kept fingerspelling with just a few signs, and I just wasn't understanding her. She was trying to use English and sign language at the same time, which just does not work. And she kept going back and forth with that and writing, and it just led to a lot of miscommunication. And it was really tough for me to make it through that.
This is TL. Can you explain why it's not appropriate to use a fingerspelling person, officer, or anyone to communicate with deaf people?
Sure, this is Kai signing. So remember, like I said before, ASL and English are completely different languages. And while fingerspelling is a part of ASL, it's essentially used as a tool to represent words that you would read or write in English. So the same problems that arise when you're writing to perform an interrogation occur when you're using fingerspelling. Both methods require the knowledge of English. So if you have a limited knowledge of English, then you're not going to understand what's being said if everything's fingerspelled. If a legalese word comes up, you still are not going to understand it when it's fingerspelled. And if someone's actually fingerspelling full sentences, then the issues about English word order come up. Like I said before, it still requires knowledge of English, even though it's visibly accessible. It's a real problem. This is Kai. Question, why is it a problem for a cop to act as an interpreter?
This is Esperanza. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's really, really dangerous because clearly it's a conflict of interest. You should be providing a neutral, qualified interpreter. And I really want to emphasize to our community that even if they bring in an officer who signs, do not talk with that person. Maybe they're deaf, maybe they have deaf parents, maybe they can fingerspell, and you'll feel like, oh, good, I can communicate with this person. But the best option is to remain silent until your lawyer is present. Even if the police bring in a qualified neutral interpreter, it's best to remain silent.
This is TL signing. Thank you so much for helping us to really get a grasp on what happened that day. Actually, several days. It wasn't just one day of interrogation. Wasn't it several days of interrogation?
This is Rico. Yeah. I mean, first I had that person who spelled out everything and all those miscommunications. Then the next day I had to sit down with my attorney and there was no interpreter there. And again, I tried to tell him, like, that person was not signing ASL. That person was spelling everything out. I didn't get what she was saying. So the next day he showed up and he had a certified interpreter, and that was good. I was able to understand that person. But that person, the previous person who had been spelling everything, I just didn't understand them. And because of that, they didn't understand me. And it looked like, you know, that I had different stories that I had been telling throughout the interrogation. But when I finally had that certified interpreter, I was able to, you know, actually express myself clearly. But there was confusion because that first person just didn't understand me. So, whew, yeah. This is Esperanza. TL, can you explain a little bit about what he just said about the conflicting stories? Can you give us a little bit more about what that is, why that's important, and how that relates to a police officer who might sign?
TL signing. So Rico's situation and so many other deaf people have this exact same situation. And what is that? It's where the deaf person is trying their utmost best to accommodate the hearing authority figures, trying to use the hearing people's preferred communication technique or language, whether that be writing or maybe texting in English or some other language, or even sometimes gesturing only for serious conversations about alleged crimes. And in Rico's situation, he waited a very long time for an appropriate, qualified, neutral, professional interpreter to show up. And instead, a retired police officer or a person who works in the police department showed up, who just knew fingerspelling and had some basic knowledge of some sign language. But generally, she was just fingerspelling. And you all saw the video. Clearly, there's no communication happening there. There were a lot of misunderstandings. She wasn't understanding him and vice versa. And later, finally, they bring in an appropriate interpreter, a qualified neutral interpreter. The family forced the attorney to contact an interpreter who actually knew what they were doing and was actually a qualified interpreter. And the police said, oh, well, your story through this person conflicts with all these previous stories you've shared with us. Between your writing with us, your texting with us, your processing with the fingerspelling police officer, and now with the formal interpreter, those stories don't match. That's what the police's perspective was. But that was because they were already targeting him. They had already assumed that he was guilty. And they assumed that the story, the conflicting of the stories, was a result of him being deceitful, as opposed to them not providing the appropriate accommodation. So they blamed him instead of blaming themselves, who had failed to follow longstanding federal disability rights laws. This is TL, and I'm just, wow, I'm in awe with just the inequities and injustice that happened in your case. So obvious too. And you're not alone. It happens to so many other disabled and deaf people. You said your lawyer didn't provide any interpreters with you either. Effective communication? What happened there?
This is Rico. Man, I will never forget that day. My attorney showed up at the jail and we had video visits there. And he wrote out, I am your lawyer. And I was like, where's the interpreter? And he wrote out, he said, I'll never forget the word. He said, I will get you out. And I was like, okay. But then the next day, he showed up again in person. We had, you know, a private conversation, private meeting. Again, no interpreter. And I was feeling like, how am I supposed to communicate with this guy? This is so, like, I told him I need an interpreter to be able to actually communicate. It's going to be way better than trying to write back and forth. Again, my language is American Sign Language, and I will understand clearly if that's the case, if I've got American Sign Language. My English is not perfect. I can understand things if it's, you know, in American Sign Language, but English, it wasn't good, man. And he didn't know, you know, anybody, anything about disability or deaf culture or anything like that. So yeah, that was the situation with that.
This is TL, right? Yeah. And you had explained, you did try to explain to the police and your attorney, hey, ASL and English are completely different languages. You tried to assert yourself and explain these things to them. What happened when you tried to explain the differences in culture and language?
This is Rico. Yeah, I mean, I had several times, I finally, I told the attorney, like, I need to have an ASL interpreter. And the attorney finally was like, I don't know, you know, he was like, I can't afford an interpreter. And I said, look, my family will pay. We've got money. We can do that. They're paying for you. They can pay for that. But again, I feel like, something was up with that attorney. Something was up with him. Like, you know, like it was a lack of like feeling like he had anything. And yeah, like, right, motivation. Exactly. And it wasn't like, oh, I know all these things. Like he was ready to, like he knew the ADA, like he was ready to roll up his sleeves and get to work. It wasn't like that. It was like he was kind of, I don't know, like it was an old-fashioned way.
This is Kai signing. So we know that lawyers and police have legal obligations in general. So what are the legal obligations that lawyers and police have for providing access for deaf disabled clients and for other people involved?
This is TL. There are strong protections for disabled people, including deaf people. I'll provide just two examples of the laws that protect the rights of deaf and disabled people during interactions with police and attorneys. The Rehabilitation Act was passed way back in the 70s. Another one that is more recent but still longstanding, has been around since the 90s, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. We all tend to use ADA, and there are strong protections under both of those laws that police and attorneys are supposed to follow. Rico deserved access to a qualified neutral interpreter, and that is required under federal disability rights laws. And clearly, the entire system, from his own attorney to the police department interrogating him, failed to follow those laws. And we see this often. Heard does. The refusal to follow the law, whether that be due to ignorance or just outright ignoring the law. And judges are included. It's not just police officers and attorneys. Judges also are ignoring law. It's shameful.
Image of written note between Rico and a hearing detective or his attorney during interrogation. Can you understand the interpreter? Somewhat, yes. Mostly, I don't use spelling words since my language is different from a different state as National Deaf of Institute. If you have any trouble, let me know. Will do.
This is TL signing. So I just want to let you know that Heard has just showed the audience a picture of your written note between yourself and I think the detective might be the lawyer, where you explain, hey, I'm not understanding this fingerspelling person.
Yeah, this is Rico. Man, I felt overwhelmed and frustrated with that. At that time, I was so exhausted. I just felt like my mind wasn't functioning, and I felt so much pressure from the police to just keep going, and they were writing back and forth, and English is not my preferred language, and again, I told them that I need an interpreter to understand this clearly. But I noticed that, most police, they will write out like the statement, and I get that. But again, a deaf person has a right to have sign language instead of being forced to use written language. Deaf people in our community signs, and I don't write perfectly. Like, my English isn't perfect. It's just not, and even if a deaf person says that they've got good English skills and good literacy, no, they need an interpreter to be able to understand. And you know, I mean, an officer or, you know, I understand that they need to write out that statement, but again, I needed ASL.
This is telling you mentioned that you had written many, many pages and you tried your best.
Yeah, I tried my best. Yeah, it was like 10 pages.
Wow. This is TL signing, and I have a question for you, Esperanza, now. Help the audience here understand better. What does it look like when a deaf or disabled person who is in the presence of and under custody of authority figures like police or lawyers, what is the experience for disabled folks who are trying to assert those accommodation or access rights that they deserve but often aren't provided? Can you explain that?
This is Esperanza signing. Yeah, sure. I mean, oftentimes, you know, they'll ask for various accommodations like an ASL interpreter or other accommodations. And the response is like, no, no, you don't need that. Or they'll, you know, find an interpreter, but it takes so much time that the person is waiting and waiting and waiting. Or, you know, if they get the appropriate accommodation, maybe there's no follow-up with that. And they'll say, oh yeah, we can do that, but then it's not the right accommodation that they're actually providing. And they don't want to, you know, offend somebody because they're, you know, they're doing their job, or they think that they're doing their job. And, you know, deaf people want to respect authority figures, and they don't want to think, the authority person doesn't want the deaf person to think that they don't know what they're doing, and they're often in a rush and time is, you know, running, the clock is ticking, and so the deaf person just kind of gives up.
My next question, this is TL, my next question is for you, Kai. I'm actually really still processing what all we're learning from Rico's case and from what you both are sharing. I remember contacting Rico some years ago. It must have been 2014, 15, and I might have even contacted him in 2013. He was in jail close to about 3 years, essentially in virtual solitary confinement and isolation. And it happens often that deaf folks are essentially placed in isolation because there's no video phone, no interpreters, no signing community. So it's a language deprivation and a communication deprivation like no other. But can you explain, Kai, the impact of that sort of isolation on the language, emotional well-being, and other aspects of a deaf or disabled person who an attorney might be coming into contact with?
Sure. This is Kai signing. So deaf people that are incarcerated often describe a feeling of isolation in isolation. So a prison within a prison, if you will. They feel isolated, firstly, because they're in a prison, and there's often no other incarcerated people that know how to communicate or know sign language. Deaf people aren't usually placed in the same location, and so there's really no one to communicate or to form relationships with, no one to talk to every day. And language knowledge and skill doesn't remain proficient if you aren't using it. Your ability to use language will decline over time, along with your mental health, your social skills, and your emotional well-being. All of these things depend on language and interaction in order to thrive. So if you don't have the ability to sign with other people, then there are negative repercussions like depression, and in other aspects of your life. It really hurts people.
This is TL. I really want to follow up on what you just shared there. Why is what you just explained help these attorneys and others understand? How does that impact client communication and the deaf person's ability to quote unquote aid in their own defense?
This is Kai signing. So if you have no or limited interaction, then your ability to communicate will decline over time. So then suppose one day the deaf incarcerated person's lawyer shows up and the client has been isolated for who knows how long, a year, 10 years, and then they're quickly expected to make sense. They're expected to communicate clearly with an attorney or with an interpreter they've never even met before. The interpreter might have a different signing style than the client's used to, or the interpreter might not have the skills to match the language of the person who's been isolated for such a long time. So it isn't appropriate to expect a deaf person to recover from isolation immediately and be able to converse with a lawyer. It requires practice, it requires multiple visits, it requires the use of a deaf interpreter, as well as a variety of other accommodations.
This is TL signing. Thank you so much for that. I think you maybe opened the eyes of a lot of people who are watching this who maybe never considered that part of what you've just described about language deprivation. This is TL signing. So you mentioned before, Rico, that you were shocked, like utterly shocked, when you had tried your best to answer all of those questions. They arrested you and you didn't understand that that was what was going to happen. You didn't anticipate that.
Yeah, this is Rico. And like, yeah, you're right, man. I said I was shocked. I mean, there was so much miscommunication and, you know, they assumed what I did, but, you know, I didn't. And I tried to explain clearly that I did not do that crime. I tried to explain it to them, but, you know, the police felt like when they read my statement that there was a lot of, you know, mistakes and that I hadn't followed the timeline, and they just felt like, you know, that I had been trying to cover, I had a cover story, but I was being honest. And, you know, even at the end, right before they arrested me, they said, you know, you are being arrested. And I felt like, I mean, the last thing I said was, you know, do you have a lie detector test? I'm telling the truth. And they said, no, we don't have that here. No. And I just, you know, I mean, they just went ahead and arrested me. And they put my hands behind my back. They didn't even put my hands in front of me. Like, they put my hands behind my back. I couldn't communicate at all. Yeah. Whew. This is Esperanza. I wanted to ask Kai, can you expand a little bit on what Rico's comment, you know, when he said he was shocked about being arrested? Can you expand on that?
This is Kai. So remember, Rico didn't have appropriate accommodations when he was interrogated. So the so-called interpreter, that was a cop who was fingerspelling the words being said, and they were communicating in writing. And so that means Rico didn't have a full schema or understanding about what was actually going on. He didn't have the same access to the environmental cues that would help him to make predictions and create expectations about what was to come. It's important to remember that the police were really friendly and polite with him. So Rico didn't expect that he was in trouble, and he was answering questions honestly. Everything he shared was true. So that's why he was so shocked when he was arrested. TL, you know a lot more about police interrogation techniques. Do you have anything more to add?
Honestly, Kai, this is TL. You really did hit the proverbial nail on the head. I mean, that's exactly right what you just shared. Police are trained, and they learn in this training during their interrogation and interview techniques are to be very friendly, precisely to coerce people into oversharing. That is the whole point of their tactics. Their formal training really provides terrible ideas and assumptions around people's behavior, how fast they respond. In fact, a lot of disabled people's natural behaviors are said by them during these trainings to be indicative of deceit. That's what they say. They don't respect culture. So there's tons of cross-cultural miscommunications and misunderstandings. And that's why we want people to avoid the system altogether. But those techniques are some of the reasons that we see so many wrongful arrests, convictions, and even coerced confessions. This is TL. Rico, I want to shift us a little bit because we're hoping now that maybe you can help other people. Who are these other people? Maybe lawyers who work with deaf and disabled people? I wonder if you have any advice for lawyers. What advice would you give lawyers to improve their ability to serve deaf and disabled people?
This is Rico. My advice to lawyers would be to know about disability, to know about deaf rights, that they are required to provide a certified, qualified interpreter, not just somebody who's making it up as they go or fingerspelling everything, somebody who actually knows the language. And if they have a deaf client, maybe a deaf person should have a card that they can give to the attorney that says, I require an American Sign Language interpreter. And so that the attorney can understand exactly what the deaf person wants, as opposed to assuming that they know what's best for the deaf person. They need to know about deaf culture, but they don't. And they need to have a better understanding of respecting what deaf people want and not just assuming that they know best. And that's the best way to show what we need, what we want. And that's our right.
This is TL. Thank you for that. Wow. The advice that Rico just shared with lawyers is extremely powerful and important. I would personally like to add and ask that lawyers really dig deep to understand and acknowledge that disabled people are disproportionately arrested, wrongfully convicted, and lawyers should be searching for disabled and deaf people in the prison system who, once they're there, generally have no way to contact anyone. And we know that disabled people are wrongfully convicted there. And my key takeaway from conversations with Rico is pay attention. I want attorneys who are doing this work to really pay attention and know and internalize that disabled folks are incarcerated and need help and can't make contact with the outside world once they're incarcerated. Maybe Kai or Esperanza, do you have feedback for attorneys based on your years of working with HERD or anything else?
This is Esperanza. Yeah, one thing that I would add that's really key for people to learn and that I really want to emphasize is that, assuming that one size fits all for every disability is not the case. If you are working with a deaf person, making sure that you have a neutral qualified interpreter and that there are other accommodations that could be necessary. Kai, do you have anything to add?
This is Kai. I would say make sure you do your research. Don't assume you know everything, especially when it comes to working with deaf and disabled people. Contact people in those respective communities to get their advice and expertise. And in addition, don't write legal arguments that instill pity or that inspire sympathy, because that implies that your client's disability should be the reason for their release when it isn't. TL?
Yeah, this is TL. I really appreciate both of your advice. I want to just add that we, of course, know that all of you are overwhelmed with cases just like we are, but you have to make more time for cases involving disabled people. You have to be more patient. You have to provide more accommodations. Time will naturally be extended on your caseload. You need to invest that time up front. And like Kai mentioned, ask for help from people who are part of those communities, who have years and years of working effectively with those communities. And that was part of the reason we set up HERD. We noticed that hearing people who had great and extensive knowledge on wrongful convictions, when we would provide them the case jacket or case transcripts, they couldn't identify very obvious red flags in cases involving deaf and disabled people. And that's because you're not part of that culture. And so that's nothing wrong with that. That means you need to involve disabled and deaf people to support in your efforts to free people. And that's my key takeaway. Thank you, Rico, for that advice to lawyers. So now that we've got advice for lawyers, what about advice for deaf and disabled people? who maybe find themselves trapped in the criminal legal system. What advice would you give to them about protecting themselves from wrongful arrest and conviction?
Yeah, this is Rico. My advice is, to utilize your right to remain silent. Don't say anything until there's an interpreter present. When the police arrest you, do not say anything. Protect yourself. Do not talk to them until your attorney is there and they can explain things clearly. I mean, that's the best way to approach it.
This is TL Wright, and unfortunately, you sadly had to learn your lesson the hard way when really the
Hmm.
police exploited you. They exploited your willingness to help them, to accommodate or over accommodate them.
Yeah, this is Rico. Yeah, I mean, if I could just add one thing, at that time back in 2013, I didn't know that I had a right to remain silent. Nobody taught me that. Hearing people know that phrase, right to remain silent, but I didn't. Nobody taught me that at that time, back in 2013 and before that. Nobody had said anything to me about that. And so when I was talking with them, I didn't realize I was making a mistake by just, talking with them. And I wish that somebody in my family or my friends had said that, like, you don't have to talk to the policeman. You can not talk to them. You can remain silent. But I mean, it was a conflict that I didn't know that. But I learned my lesson. I should have said nothing. And you have a right to remain silent.
This is Kai. Rico said it exactly right. And just because you have an interpreter present, even if they're qualified, even if they're neutral, it is never a good idea to say anything to the police. Maybe Esperanza has some tips to share about how to best approach that situation.
This is Esperanza. Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, it's really important to not talk with the police at all. It's important to remain silent and calm. Make sure that an attorney is provided, and until the attorney arrives, just let them know also that you need an interpreter, whatever your accommodation needs are, and make sure that that you are in a confidential and private environment, that the cops aren't involved in your conversation with your attorney. And if you have an attorney and an interpreter is there, but it's an interpreter you don't understand, you have a right to ask for another interpreter or another accommodation. And do not trust the police or anyone in that system. Do not share the information that they're asking for. Definitely remain silent.
This is TL Rico. Wow, I just want to thank you for your time, sharing your time and knowledge with us today. And to your point, we now have Heard has created many videos that are in ASL and accessible with captions and transcripts that deaf community members and disabled folks can now watch and learn, like you now know, how to protect themselves from arrest and wrongful conviction. And I've learned so much from this conversation today myself, so thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is Rico. I really appreciate, you taking the time, and I want the community to, learn something new, that, they need to wake up and see what the world is really like. It's not just what you think it is, right? It's time to wake up.
TL, right, because no one else needs to have the experience that you have. We have to stop this from it continue before it happens, and that's the goal. And now Heard and your new attorney are fighting to get you out, but no one deserves to be stuck in prison. No one deserves this. So we hope that maybe people will learn how to protect themselves so this can stop happening over and over and over again. And thank you again so much for your time and your knowledge and experience and sharing that with us. And soon, maybe you'll meet the people you've just taught all of this information to.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that day when I can get out and I can, help the community learn from my experience and everything I've been through. But I really appreciate being able to help people. I mean, I want the community to feel equal, that there's not, that inequality between hearing and deaf people, and deaf people don't need hearing people thinking that, you know, that they're less than or second class citizens, man. We're all human.
TL 100% agree. Well, Kai and Esperanza, I think we're coming to a close. Thank you and thanks again to Rico for joining us. And I want to just emphasize, this is a systemic issue. It's not just with Rico. People might think his case is exceptional. This happens all the time in the criminal legal system. Heard and others who focus on dismantling and abolishing the carceral system literally see what Rico has explained every single day. Abuse of deaf and disabled people in prison is rampant. Wrongful convictions of deaf and disabled people are rampant. Parole and probation aren't providing access to information, so there's this ridiculous cycle of returning back into carceral systems for our communities. His case is not exceptional, and that's what I want to emphasize. And I guess I hope that lawyers and legal advocates and others who leave today leave feeling more armed to address and fight this system, and that you would partner and be in solidarity with us. None of us can do this alone. We have to be working together to dismantle the harmful and violent criminal legal system and carceral system that's impacting our communities so negatively. And I guess our other hope, as heard, is that the Innocence Network begins to focus your work on disability broadly, centering disability justice and centering disability rights in your work. For example, making sure that your conferences and meetings are accessible, have interpreters and captioners, making sure that your intake processes are effective for people with disabilities and accessible for people with disabilities, making sure that you yourselves provide the appropriate accommodations during interrogation, your own interviews with our deaf and disabled community who you are working to do intakes on, for example. Those are just some ideas that I could go on forever, but I think we're out of time. I guess you all can also follow us on social media. We have Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I'll provide those links after this video goes off. And we also have videos on this topic for people who really want to dive deeper. I'll share those a little bit later. We have videos on wrongful convictions and mass incarceration of disabled and deaf people. So thank you again for your time, and take good care.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
everyone.